The permissible exposure level is 5 micrograms per cubic meter of Cr6 in air as an 8-hour time-weighted average. The action level is 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter of Cr6 in air as an 8-hour time-weighted average. Employers shall determine the 8-hour time-weighted average exposure for each exposed employee using the scheduled monitoring option or the performance-oriented option. The scheduled monitoring option is to perform the initial monitoring to determine 8-hour time-weighted average for each employee, with a sufficient number, breathing zone, and done at each shift, job classification, and area. You can also do a representative sampling of worst-case exposures instead of sampling all affected employees. You may discontinue the scheduled monitoring option if all initial monitoring results are below the action level. This is verified by repeat sampling at 7 days later. You must resample every 3 months if exposure is greater than or equal to the permissible exposure level. You must also resample every 6 months if exposure is greater than or equal to the action level, but less than the permissible exposure level. When a change to a process, materials, or equipment occurs, or when you think additional exposures have occurred, you must also resample. In the performance-oriented option, exposures are determined by a combination of the following: air monitoring data, historical monitoring data, and objective data that accurately characterizes exposure. What is objective data? It is exposure data from industry-wide surveys. Calculations based on chemical or physical properties of a substance that show exposure will not exceed the permissible exposure limit. Conditions, activities, etc. must closely resemble the employer's current operations. Employees must be notified of sampling results within 15 days of receipt. The employer must post where all affected employees will see or notify each affected person in writing. If the permissible exposure limit is exceeded, notification must also include actions being taken to reduce exposures. The accuracy of exposure monitoring is critical. You must use a valid sampling method. Results must meet criteria for accuracy, CL 95% at or above action level. Recognized sample methods are the OSHA ID 215 hexavalent chromium total or the NIOSH 7600 hexavalent chromium soluble. In observation of monitoring, the affected employee and their representative can observe. You must ensure observers have proper protective equipment for exposure levels that may be encountered. The employer must establish regulated areas when exposures have exceeded or are expected to exceed the permissible exposure level. These areas must be marked in a manner that clearly identify boundaries. Access to these areas must be restricted, allowing only authorized employees, designated employee representatives, and anyone authorized by OSHA.